how could an aircraft find itself trying to take off with 100,000 kilos more weight on board than what the pilots had calculated with? And exactly what would happen if it did? Well, that's the fascinating story that I will share with you today, so stay tuned. When you check in your bag at the airport, you've probably noticed signs talking about overweight luggage, and maybe you wondered what would happen if you would go slightly above that limit. Of course, on an airliner, one overweight bag doesn't make much of a difference at all, but what if you forgot something that weighed more than, let's say, a fully loaded Boeing 737? Well, surprisingly, this has actually happened, multiple times in fact, and the reason behind are as simple as they are complicated. This particular story started on the 9th of July 2024 at Milan Malpensa Airport in Italy, where a flight crew from LATAM Airlines Brazil had just arrived to operate a long-haul flight over to Sao Paulo. Now, as a subsidiary of the Chile-based LATAM Airlines group, LATAM Brazil is the largest international airline in Brazil, with a fleet of 170 aircraft, including 10 wide-body Boeing 777-300s. Now, one of those was waiting at the gate in Malpensa, ready to operate LATAM Flight 8073 over to Sao Paulo with a scheduled departure time of 13:30 local. The crew that had been planned to operate this flight included no less than 3 captains. A newly promoted trainee captain, a line training captain who was providing the training, and a relief captain whose job it was to take over as they rotated to get their mandatory rest breaks during the 11-hour flight over to South America. Now, the trainee captain who was going to be sitting in the left seat was 53 years old and had an impressive 16,689 total hours. He had earned those partially during his 23 years with LATAM, but since he had just started on the Boeing 777, he had only flown about 95 hours on that type so far. Instead, he had spent most of his career on the much smaller Airbus A320, and this was actually going to be his first stint on a wide-body, as well as his first time flying a Boeing, except a few hours on the 737 almost a quarter of a century earlier. On this day, he had only completed 9 flights in the 777 and was therefore still doing his line training under supervision of a line training captain. Now, that captain was 54 years old and had accrued an even more impressive 18,921 flight hours over a 28-year career with the company, which included 1,333 hours on the Boeing 777. He was qualified as a line training captain on both the 777 and the 787, which he flew interchangeably, and that's worth keeping in mind because of what's about to happen. You see, normally we pilots can only fly one aircraft type or group of aircraft with a common type rating at one time, but even though the 777 and the 787 doesn't really have a common type rating, they're similar enough that many airlines around the world lets their pilots fly both simultaneously. And for LATAM Brazil, that was ideal, because they only had one 787 in their fleet, so it was very efficient for them to be able to use their 777 pilots to fly it. Anyway, the third and final pilot was the relief captain, who was 56 years old and had 17,530 total hours across a 27-year career with the airline. But out of those, only 418 hours had been flown on the 777, which he had only started flying a few months earlier, after 11 years on the little bit smaller Boeing 767. So, taken together, these 3 pilots made up an incredibly experienced team with a combined total of more than 50,000 hours and 78 years of experience. All 3 pilots had worked well together on the outbound flight to Milan, which had arrived on the morning of July the 8th, and they had then spent 24 hours resting at a hotel before taking a shuttle back to the airport ahead of this coming flight. And while they had been sitting there on the bus, the pilots had received their flight plan, fuel requirements, weather information, NOTAMs, etc. from a proprietary LATAM Airlines smartphone app. And they have therefore taken the opportunity to review all of this information while they were just sitting there. And they saw that there was nothing really unusual at all about the flight that was coming up. Maybe it was a little bit hot for their departure, with an outside temperature hovering at around 30 degrees Celsius, but the weather was otherwise fine, with totally clear sunny conditions and a slight variable breeze. So by the time the pilots arrived at the terminal and boarded their 12-year-old Boeing 777, they were probably expecting this to be a normal and uneventful flight, except for the slightly unusual combination of 3 captains on the flight deck, of course. As they started their pre-flight setup, the only dispatch document that they were waiting for was, as usual, the load sheet. That's a document which lists the exact weight of the fuel, baggage and passengers on board for the purpose of making performance and weight and balance calculations. And it always tends to come a little bit late, as there might be changes in passengers and cargo, which is only really found out during the check-in and boarding process. So whilst they were waiting for that, the pilots decided that the trainee captain would be pilot monitoring for the initial part of the flight, while the line trainee captain in the right seat would be pilot flying. And this would suit the training plan fine, since the new captain was required to act as pilot monitoring during at least one leg of this supervised trip. And on top of that, the training captain also wanted to give the trainee captain some focused practice on the pre-flight procedures, so as this pre-flight got on the way, he was mentally very much in instruction mode. Meanwhile, as the 2 other captains were setting up the flight deck, the relief captain would handle the exterior inspection, liaise with the cabin crew and conduct passenger announcements. After that, he was supposed to take up his position on the cockpit jump seat for departure before heading back to the crew rest area until it was time for him to take over the controls later on. Now, whilst he would be on the jump seat, he was also supposed to keep an eye on his 2 colleagues, as he was officially part of the operating crew. But I can say from experience that it is quite easy to let the attention drift a bit when you don't have any real active duties to do. In any case, fueling had already been on the way when the pilots and their cabin crew arrived to the aircraft, so after having checked that they had their planned fuel quantity on board, 109,625 kilos to be exact, the pilots together concluded that they wouldn't need any additional fuel beyond that, which was a little bit unusual but welcome, since it meant that the fueler could now leave and the load sheet could be completed. Now, the cockpit voice recording began sometime after that decision had been taken, so the first words on the recording showed the pilots performing the takeoff briefing, which involved discussing the planned taxi, takeoff and departure, as well as the expected takeoff performance. But because they still hadn't received the load sheet at that point, they now deferred that last item, the performance, and instead just continued the briefing. Now, there will soon be a lot of things to keep track of here in order to understand how this was allowed to happen. And when we're on that subject, actually writing these episodes and keeping track of all of the info is not easy. I often find myself with dozens of different tabs open on my screen, showing everything from the final report to ATPL booklets, performance data and historical cases. And that's why I am using today's sponsor, Opera. I just love how Opera is basically built for this kind of deep dive research and scripting. For example, I can group everything I use into tab islands, one for aircraft performance, one for historical and current procedures, and one for relevant accidents. And then there's also the split screen, which let me compare things side by side, so I can look at company and generic Boeing procedures next to each other and at the same time see weather data and airport layouts. Now, if things would still become a little bit chaotic, which they do, then tab trays will show me which tabs that I have used the most recently. The darker the underscore, the more recently I've looked at it. Which might sound simple, but you'd be amazed of just how much time and energy it actually saves. But probably the most useful feature is Opera AI, which is built directly into the browser, so I don't need any extra tabs or tools or anything like that. I can just ask it to summarize a diagram, explain a concept, or analyze a page that I'm looking at. And that helps a lot during major investigations like this one. Now, you can try Opera out for free yourself by using the link here in the description below, which I highly recommend. And I'd love to hear what you think of them as well. Thank you, Opera. Now let's get back to the cockpit. Around 6 minutes later, the relief captain then received the load sheet on his cell phone, which he forwarded to his iPad, but the trainee captain couldn't get his download to work. Back in the day at LATAM Airlines, the pilots used to receive an actual physical copy of the load sheet, but now this was all sent via this proprietary app, which everyone wasn't that happy with, since it meant that there was no longer any possibility to put the load sheet up on the central pedestal for easy reference. Anyway, the relief captain just gave the training captain his iPad to read off of, and he then dictated the zero fuel weight, takeoff gross weight and center of gravity to the trainee captain, who now entered them into the CDU. The zero fuel weight is pretty much what it sounds like. It's the weight of the airplane, including all passengers, baggage and cargo, but without the fuel. And in this case, after accounting for all 398 occupants and their bags, the zero fuel weight was calculated to be 219,460 kilograms, with the projected takeoff weight, including the fuel, being 328,425 kilograms. Now this takeoff weight was delivered by adding the weight of the fuel to the zero fuel weight and then subtracting the weight of the taxi out fuel that was expected to be burned during the startup and taxi out to the runway. And knowing the precise takeoff weight is crucial, because that's what we use to determine both the takeoff thrust setting, flaps, and also the takeoff or V speeds. You see, on modern airliners, we very rarely use full thrust for takeoff, since that causes a lot of excess wear and tear on the engines, it uses more fuel and also causes more noise. So instead, we tend to only use the exact amount of thrust that we actually need in order for the aircraft to get into the air safely. That thrust value is going to depend on several things, like the length of the runway, the temperature and the altitude, but of course especially on the takeoff weight of the aircraft. Now a takeoff thrust that's lower than the takeoff go-around or toga thrust is referred to as a D-rated thrust. And on most modern aircraft, that's achieved by inputting something known as an assumed temperature or flex temperature on Airbus, which is higher than the actual outside air temperature. You see, the engine electronic control system, or EECs, varies the amount of thrust that can be delivered based on the ambient temperature in order to avoid going outside of its calculated limits. So if you enter a higher than actual temperature, this basically tricks the EECs into using a lower thrust limit, thus achieving that D rate. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention. But then we also have the calculation of the V speeds. These speeds consist of V1, which is the decision speed above which you're committed to continue the takeoff, VR, which is the rotation speed where you start pulling back in order to lift the nose and the aircraft off the runway, and then V2, which is the takeoff safety speed, the minimum speed you have to achieve to maintain a safe climb gradient in the event of an engine failure. Now these speeds are very heavily dependent on the takeoff weight as well as the length of the runway, and if they're not calculated correctly, the consequences can be very serious. Remember that, because I'm going to dive deeper into that a little bit later. Now, I need to also talk a little bit here about how Boeing 777 pilots at LATAM Airlines calculated their V-speeds and their takeoff thrust, as well as the checks that were built into those procedures in order to verify that those calculations were correct. After receiving the load sheet, the standard practice was to enter the zero fuel weight and the center of gravity into the 777's flight management computer using the control display unit, or CDU, which is that little computer interface that we pilots use in order to interact with the flight management system. And with those values entered, the flight management computer would then automatically calculate the gross weight of the aircraft by adding the automatically detected weight of the fuel in the aircraft's tanks, and then display this figure on the performance initialization page in the CDU, or perf init. The pilots were then supposed to check the fuel on board against the flight plan to make sure that it made sense, and then check the gross weight against the load sheet. But remember, the load sheet doesn't show the gross weight, it only shows the takeoff weight, and the CDU doesn't display the takeoff weight, which excludes the taxi fuel, only the gross weight. Now, when I'm talking about this subject, I always get asked why the plane doesn't already know its own weight, or why most planes don't have weight sensors in their landing gear struts. And the simple answer is that it's actually surprisingly hard to design a system that's capable of estimating the weight more accurately than the load sheet math already does, so there isn't actually that much value in such an expensive retrofit, and also just to keep it calibrated would be a nightmare. But some investigations have recommended the installation of a weight sensing system anyway, in order to provide a gross error check against data entry error by the pilots, and we will soon see why. In any case, after entering the zero fuel weight into the CDU, the pilots are then supposed to calculate the performance figures using the Boeing Onboard Performance Tool, or OPT, which is loaded into 2 iPads that are stored in the cockpit of every aircraft. Each pilot is supposed to independently enter the takeoff weight, runway information, weather and so on into the OPT, which then produces a recommended thrust setting in the form of an assumed temperature as well as the V-speeds. After that, the 2 pilots should then cross-check each other's results to make sure that they match, or if they don't, then they should clarify any differences. Now, this procedure didn't define where the pilots should get the takeoff weight from. They could get it from the load sheet, which includes the takeoff weight, or they could get it by mentally subtracting the startup and taxi fuel weight from the gross weight displayed on the CDU. Remember that, because it's about to become really important. Anyway, after cross-checking the results of the iPad calculations, the non-flying pilot should then enter the assumed temperature into the thrust limit page of the CDU, and then enter the V-speeds on the takeoff reference page, and on that page the CDU will then display reference V-speeds in a column labeled Ref. And those speeds are derived automatically from the aircraft weight entered in the performance initialization page, and the thrust information entered on the thrust limit page. So those are basically the speeds that the aircraft itself suggests the pilots to use. When the pilots manually enter the V-speeds, which they get from their OPTs, they should therefore compare those with the aircraft's reference speeds as a form of gross error check. Basically, those 2 sets of speeds should be within a couple of knots of each other, and if they're not, well then someone somewhere probably have made a mistake. Now, after that check, the pilots should then complete the rest of the before start checklist and finally ask for pushback and start up their engine. So, as you can see, this procedure has a lot of built-in cross-checks and redundancies, but there are still some areas where potential errors could creep in. So let's now return to the cockpit of Flight 8073, where these 3 very experienced pilots were just about to begin this very same procedure. Immediately after having received the load sheet, the trainee captain preliminarily ran through the performance numbers using his iPad and noticed nothing unusual. Also, after he and the training captain had entered the zero fuel weight into the CDU, he saw that it produced a gross weight figure, but he soon forgot what it was. In fact, just seconds later, the Malpensa clearance delivery controller suddenly called the aircraft up and informed the pilots that they were number 2 for pushback and that their scheduled departure time had been moved up. Now, this introduced some unexpected time pressure here and gave the pilots very limited time to finish their performance calculations and get everything else ready. Now, both interruptions and time pressure are factors that increase the risk of errors and reduce the effectiveness of cross-checks, which is always worth keeping in mind in whatever job you have. If this happens, ask yourself, do I really need to speed up, or can I slow things down somehow? And in most cases the answer will be, yeah, I can slow things down. Anyway, while some chatter from the clearance delivery frequency continued to play over the cockpit speakers, the pilots now hurried to finish the performance calculations on their iPads. But by the time the trainee captain opened his OPT application, he had forgotten the gross weight that was calculated on the CDU. So in order to obtain the takeoff weight to put into the OPT, he needed to either navigate back to the CDU's performance initialization page, obtain the gross weight and then subtract the startup and taxi fuel, or look at the load sheet in the company's smartphone app and get the takeoff weight from there. But remember, he hadn't received the load sheet on his smartphone yet. At that same time, the training captain decided to look at the gross weight from the CDU and mentally just subtract the 400 kilos of taxi fuel from it to get the takeoff weight. And he did so, and then he said the result out loud. One moment, OPT 228.8. Now, it's not completely clear from the final report whether the training captain said that number out loud because he was trying to provide that information to the other captain, or whether he was just narrating his thoughts, though it seems likely that it was probably on purpose. But in either case, he had just made an absolutely huge error. Because as he now entered the figure of 228.8 metric tons into the takeoff weight field in his OPT, the actual takeoff weight was 328 tons, not 228. So how was that possible? Well, most likely, whilst mentally subtracting the taxi fuel, the training captain just lost a digit in the hundreds place. You know, the kind of brain fart that make you groan when you get your math test handed back in school. But of course, the procedure still required both pilots to perform the OPT calculations independently and then cross-check, specifically to catch this type of error. But instead of looking at the CDU and obtaining the takeoff weight himself, the trainee captain now just listened to what his colleague was saying and entered that same thing. Maybe to save time, or maybe because he was under training and therefore just trusted his instructor. Now this clearly violated the requirement for independent calculations, because now the same wrong figure had been entered into both pilots' iPads, and that obviously then led to the pilots receiving the same flap setting, assumed temperature and V-speeds back from it, all of which were now intended for an aircraft that was 100,000 kilograms lighter than their actual weight. And that's a lot, by the way. 100,000 kilos is substantially more than the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 737NG, or, put it another way, about 17 adult male African elephants. Now, if you forgot to add the weight of 17 elephants in the cabin, someone would likely notice that. But in this case, the pilots just cross-checked the results and moved on. So with that, I feel that I have to address the elephant in the room, which is, why didn't this number just feel wrong to them? You see, generally, after you've been flying an aircraft type for a while, you start to get a ballpark sense of the performance numbers that you usually get, so you can normally pick up a faulty number quite easily. But in this case, the training captain might not have felt that 228 tons was an abnormally low number, because that is a perfectly ordinary takeoff weight on the Boeing 7879, which he was also flying at the time. And at the same time, the trainee captain actually did recognize that the results were different from the numbers that he had gotten during his quick preliminary calculation, but those numbers had now been overwritten. And because he was performing only his 10th flight on the 777, after having spent many years on the Airbus A320, he probably hadn't fully developed that instinctive number sense yet. And on top of that, even though he was nominally the pilot in command, the instructional tone of his interactions with the training captain during the pre-flight might have predisposed him to just accept what he was told, instead of taking ultimate responsibility for that himself. Now, I have been training new captains in similar scenarios, and it is really, really hard as an instructor to get the feeling in the cockpit right, where the trainee captain feels like they are in charge, but whilst you still can instruct them. It is super, super easy to just transform back into a captain, in which case you basically end up with a first officer in the left seat, and stuff like this can happen. And finally, the relief captain wasn't paying attention to the performance calculation at all, since at that point he was busy coordinating with the cabin crew. Now, even with these factors, someone might still have second-guessed the numbers if it hadn't been for that time pressure that had just been introduced. And what all this meant was that after agreeing that the results matched, the pilots now just jumped straight into entering the performance data into the CDU without a second thought. Remember, the OPT results only had to match each other. There was no cross-check against the gross weight already calculated by the CDU. In any case, for the thrust D rate, the pilot's OPTs now calculated an assumed temperature of 56 degrees Celsius, which would reduce the thrust output during the takeoff quite a bit, as you would expect for a very light aircraft, which, according to OPT, now only weighed 228 tons. It also called for a flap setting of 5 degrees, which is not unusual for takeoff, but was the lowest setting available, producing the least amount of lift. So after having entered the assumed temperature into the thrust limit page of the CDU, the pilots then flipped over to the takeoff reference page and entered the calculated flap setting, followed by the V speeds: 145 knots for V1, 149 for VR, and 156 for V2. Now those values were obviously much too low. At the weight that they were actually at, the speeds should have been 173 knots for V1, 181 for VR, and 186 for V2, so about 30 knots higher across the board. And at this point, they were now coming up against the next cross-check, the comparing of the OPT-derived V-speeds against the reference V-speeds produced by the CDU, which should have made this error obvious. But to the pilot's great surprise, those reference speeds were now missing. To be perfectly honest, they shouldn't even have been able to enter these faulty V-speeds into the CDU at all, since the system normally prohibits entering V-speeds that are lower than the CDU calculated reference speeds. But in this specific case, there weren't any reference speeds shown at all, so that protection didn't apply. Instead, the CDU scratchpad now displayed a message that read "V-speeds unavailable," with no further explanation than that. Now the reason for this was actually their selected assumed temperature of 56 degrees. You see, at the actual aircraft weight known to the FMC, there was no way that the aircraft could take off with that D rate. The runway just wasn't long enough with that thrust and flap setting, so the aircraft responded to that by not showing any speeds at all. But of course that message, V-speeds unavailable, was a pretty obscure way of communicating this. Now none of the pilots could remember having ever seen that message before, and it was only mentioned in one brief passage in the flight crew operations manual as well. It stated that this message could occur with certain combinations of high weight and low thrust, or low weight and high thrust, where the performance margins were basically exceeded. The manual then gave some fixes to this, but it didn't suggest that the pilots should recheck the performance data that they had entered. But it also clearly said that a takeoff was not allowed with this message shown. Now none of this helped in this case, since the pilots never checked their manual. The training captain did read the message out loud when he saw it, but none of the pilots knew what it meant. The relief captain in the back just briefly suggested checking whether the reference V-speed function was turned on, which the training captain then did and verified that it was, so that clearly wasn't the reason. At this point, if they would have had some extra time available, they might have pulled out the manual and discovered that the takeoff with that message, V-speed unavailable, was actually prohibited, and that could then possibly have led them back to their load sheet and helped them to discover their error. But since they didn't, one of the last safety barriers was now crossed and the jaws of disaster had started opening up. The training captain now just told his colleagues to proceed, so they just accepted their manually entered speeds and went ahead to finish the before start checklist. Time to get this aircraft airborne. Now, before we go any further here, it's important to highlight what some of the potential consequences would be of what I've shown you so far. Obviously, the first risk with having a too low thrust setting is that the plane just won't be able to reach its takeoff speed before the end of the runway. And in most cases, that problem is then also coupled with a calculated too low rotation speed. You see, the rotation speed is designed to be high enough so that by the time we reach it, the plane naturally wants to become airborne. In other words, the lift that the wings can produce should be greater than the aircraft's own weight. But in order for that to happen, you need airspeed. So if you end up rotating too early, well then the plane just won't have enough lift to climb away. And that in turn will mean that the nose will come up, but the plane will just continue rolling down the runway on its rear wheels until it's built up enough speed to actually fly. And that's risky for two different reasons. Firstly, if the airplane doesn't lift off when the pilot rotates normally, well then the pilot might instinctively continue rotating more or deliberately try to pull in order to get the aircraft off the ground, which can then cause the tail of the aircraft to strike the runway. Now that can lead to structural damage, preventing the later pressurization of the aircraft, or even worse outcomes than that. The second issue is that rolling down the runway with the nose high up in the air greatly increases the drag. And that comes from both the form drag due to the greater surface area that is now facing the airstream, and the induced drag created by the high angle of attack of the wings. And if that's combined with the tail also striking the ground, that obviously also adds drag. So all of this will make it harder to accelerate up to the appropriate takeoff speed, and if the thrust setting is already insufficient, which is what has caused this in the first place, well then this could all combine lead to the aircraft overrunning the runway and a potentially catastrophic ending. Now, you might be thinking, surely with all of the training that pilots receive, there is no way that this could be a regular occurrence. And actually, you would be wrong. In 2004, for example, an MK Airlines Boeing 747 cargo plane crashed after a crew member had accidentally populated the takeoff weight field in their OPT with the weight from their previous takeoff, where they didn't have any cargo on board. Then again, in 2009, an Emirates Airbus A340 was departing Melbourne in Australia when the pilots accidentally entered a takeoff weight that was also exactly 100 tons too low. Now that aircraft then ended up getting airborne beyond the end of the runway, striking the localizer antenna array in the process, but after that it luckily returned and landed safely. But in yet another incident, back in 2015, the crew of a Boeing 777 cargo aircraft, which was preparing for takeoff from Paris-Charles de Gaulle, again inadvertently dropped a digit and entered a takeoff weight that was 100 tons too low. That plane ended up rotating before it had enough speed to do so, almost causing a tailstrike, but it did eventually get airborne just before the end of the runway. And the investigation into that incident found that one of the pilots had verbalized the incorrect takeoff weight, exactly like in this case. Now, my point in sharing these stories is to highlight that the problem here likely wasn't only the involved crew. Something systemic was also at play here. Anyway, completely unaware of the danger that they had now set up for themselves, the pilots of LATAM Flight 8073 received clearance to push back from the gate at time 13:05, just 10 minutes after receiving the load sheet. Then, at time 13:14, they were cleared to taxi out towards runway 35 left, and at time 13:21, the captain reported reaching the holding point. Now, the tower initially held them in that position for about 4 minutes or so, and then at time 13:25, they were finally cleared for takeoff. Moments later, the aircraft lined up with the runway, and the captain moved the thrust levers into the takeoff position. This caused the 777's two huge GE90 engines to spool up to 92.8% N1, which was the limit imposed by the selected assumed temperature of 56 degrees. The aircraft now started slowly accelerating down the runway, and on a runway that is that long, the pilots didn't initially notice that they were gaining speed slower than normal. The pilot monitoring called out 80 knots, which was then followed by a checked from the training captain, and 35 seconds into the takeoff roll, the aircraft automated voice called out V1 at a speed of 145 knots, which of course we know was about 30 knots too early. Now, since nobody had calculated the V1 for their real weight and thrust setting, it was at this point actually impossible to know where the real decision point actually was. So even if these pilots would have now realized their mistake, they wouldn't know if they had enough runway left to reject. But at this point, they were all still blissfully unaware of their mistake. So 3 seconds after that V1 call-out, the aircraft reached its calculated rotation speed of 149 knots, which the pilot monitoring called out, And the training captain now started pulling back on his control column, like he had done countless times before. Only this time, the airplane didn't lift off. In fact, at this point, they were nowhere near the speed required to generate enough lift for the aircraft to fly, so while the nose did start to rise, the main landing gear remained firmly attached to the ground, now eating up the remaining runway with an alarming speed. This whole thing caught the training captain completely by surprise, and for several seconds he therefore just continued pulling back instinctively to get the aircraft up into the air. Now recognizing that its tail was about to hit the runway, the 777's built-in tailstrike protection system kicked in and applied a nose-down component to the elevator deflection command to try and prevent the imminent tailstrike. But its efforts were sadly unsuccessful. As the plane accelerated through 160 knots, the tail slammed hard into the runway, kicking up a dramatic cloud of dust and debris as it dragged itself along the asphalt. For several seconds, the pilots seemed stunned, caught like deer in the headlights in something called the startle effect, while this monumental tail strike just kept happening. Behind them, the tail skid, which is designed to absorb some of the forces from a tail strike, now gorged a 6 centimeter deep scar into the runway surface, scattering fragments of metal and pavement in its wake. In the cockpit, the training captain shouted out a curse and exclaimed, "It's not working! Something strange! It's not working!" But recognizing that the aircraft wasn't responding, the relief captain now just shouted from the jump seat, "Toga!" urging the pilots to push the thrust levers forward into maximum takeoff thrust. Still struggling to comprehend what was going on, the training captain just replied with a questioning noise, so the relief captain quickly called the same thing again, "Toga!" And this time, the training captain reacted promptly and firewalled both thrust levers. This caused the two giant engines to start spooling up further, and with that, they began to overcome the drag of the high pitch attitude and the tail strike, finally forcing the airplane into the air at a speed of 178 knots. So after having dragged its tail for an incredible 723 meters, Flight 8073 finally became airborne about 80% of the way down the runway, largely thanks to the relief captain's situational awareness and timely intervention. Now, I absolutely have to shout out the relief captain's actions here. It takes a real pro to not only figure out what to do, but also to give clear and unambiguous instructions in a situation which included so much confusion. Calling Toga was basically the only thing he could have done, which was simple enough to save the situation and not just make it worse, so well done. Anyway, as the plane cleared the end of the runway and started climbing away into the bright blue sky, the trainee captain soon announced, "Positive climb," and the training captain called for gear up. By this point, the flight data recorder had also captured a loss of pressure in both fire extinguisher bottles for the APU caused by the tailstrike damage in the back, and the tailstrike detector had also sensed the impact and was now sending a tailstrike warning message on the Engine Indication and Crew Alerting System, or ACAS. The relief captain noticed that message and called it out, and that was then followed by a continuous repetitive chime alerting the crew to the damage. So after having climbed to a safe altitude, the pilots now pulled out the quick reference handbook and followed the abnormal procedure for a tail strike, which called for them to avoid pressurizing the airplane, to avoid any further damage to the hull, and then to land at the nearest suitable airport. And this meant that the crew just leveled off at 6,000 feet to discuss their options. With all of the fuel for the transatlantic journey still on board, the 777 was now far over its maximum landing weight. So the relief captain suggested dumping that fuel, or some of it, before attempting to land. And since there were luckily no signs of any control issues or further system failures other than the APU fire extinguishers, the training captain now agreed. He then also switched over to the left seat and let the relief captain take the right seat in order to utilize the most experienced crew members for the coming approach and landing. And all of this showed really good failure management and generally nice non-normal handling. I should also mention here that the 777 could have landed overweight if the emergency would have been more severe, but that would have put undue stress on the landing gear and brakes and other structures. So since this crew now didn't really know how badly damaged the back of their aircraft was, reducing the fuel was, in my view, a pretty good idea. Air traffic control soon directed them out over a rural area southwest of Milan, where any side effects of the fuel dump would be minimized, and the pilots then circled for about 36 minutes, releasing as much fuel as they possibly could, until the weight was sufficiently reduced. After that, they turned inbound for a normal approach and landing on runway 35 right, which was reasonably uneventful, except they also then suffered a bird strike on final. But at time 14:36, they landed safely back at Milan again. Thankfully, none of the 398 passengers and crew were hurt in this incident, and the aircraft was later ferried back to LATAM Brazil's base in Sao Paulo, where it was repaired and returned to service by February of 2025. The investigation by Italy's National Flight Safety Agency, ANSV, found that LATAM Airlines procedures contained ambiguities, such as a failure to explicitly prohibit verbalizing data during the OPT entry, as well as a lack of clarity about where the pilots should find the takeoff weight, which increased the risk of human error. Now, in his statement, the training captain suggested that there should also be a final cross-check between the load sheet, the OPT and the CDU to ensure that the data in all three sources agreed. But the ANSV pointed out that new procedures might not be the best solution here. The pre-flight phase is already jammed full of checklists, checks and cross-checks, and with so many dispatch tasks also now being dumped onto flight crews, adding even more checks would likely only increase the pressure to complete all of the tasks within the expected turnaround time, potentially undermining its own benefit. Instead, the ANSV wrote that procedures alone doesn't seem to prevent flight crews from making performance calculation errors when under pressure. So the best solution would be to develop flight management system software that could detect and flag gross errors instead, and in fact, that technology already exists. In 2025, the European Aviation Safety Agency announced that all newly developed large aircraft would be required to have a takeoff performance monitoring system, capable of identifying and alerting the crew to performance errors both before and during the takeoff. Existing aircraft types currently in production will also have to have this system beginning in 2033, but it won't need to be retrofitted onto aircraft that are already in service. Airbus right now offers this system as an optional retrofit to older aircraft, but most probably still won't have it for quite a number of years from now, which personally I think is a real shame. In the meantime, LATAM Airlines have also updated its pre-flight procedures to remove any ambiguities, and they have also improved their flight data monitoring program to detect takeoff performance-related events on its fleet. But the lesson that I want to really highlight here is that these type of huge errors are probably much more likely than you think, and it can happen to absolutely anyone if you're not careful. But at the same time, I also want to point out something else. And that is that even after these guys underestimated their weight by 100 metric tons, there was still enough of a performance margin available to allow this giant aircraft to get airborne inside of the available runway, showing just how much safety margins that we build into this fantastic industry. Aviation remains incredibly safe, and my team and I are here to help spread the word about these type of lessons to hopefully make things even safer. Now, if you want to help us with this mission and get to preview all my videos before everyone else, well then please scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and become a member of my awesome Patreon crew. And here, by the way, are also some fantastic comments that you have left on last week's video, so please continue to send those in because we absolutely love reading them. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.